last, I don't know, 45, 50 years, mainly in the Death Valley region, and he's a friend of mine. So he and I are now starting a new show called Mark and Ted's History Adventures. Mark and Ted's History Adventures are going to be on YouTube. Hard to find, right? And we are going to be going out and doing 15, 20-minute drives out to historic sites in southern Nevada, southern California, southern Arizona. And the whole idea is that we're going to go out to sites that anyone can drive to. You don't have to go on an overland hike. You don't have to hike up a mountain. Don't have to do any of that. Anyone can drive to these sites and see an historic location. Now, some of them you may know, but you may not know the history of, and some of them you may not know. We've filmed the first 5 of them, to give you an idea of the kinds of things we're doing. We've done Jean, Nevada. You know who Jean was? Maybe not. May not have any idea why Jean even exists. Today, doesn't have the same reason that it did in 1904 when it got started. How about those giant concrete arrows that you find from one end of the country to the other? Well, I took Ted out to one of those, and we talk about the night airway beacons and why those existed, and things like that. The Golden Spike site on the Union Pacific, and sites like this. So we're going to be doing these. The show will go live in May. We're going to be doing a new episode every month, or every week, sorry. And that's what I've been told, so I'm going to be very busy doing these things. So anyways, we're going to have a new show on YouTube, and it's Mark and Ted's History Adventures. If you want to go look at it, you can. If you don't. That's the way it works. Okay, let me see how this works. That's not the right one. Is that the right one? No, turn it off that way, Mark. Huh. There it goes. Now, all right. Now let's talk about museums. What's more exciting than that? Well, I don't think there's much more exciting than museums. I spent 44 years of my life running them. But museums in the Western Territories and states began a few years after the organization of those Western Territories as part of the United States, and much earlier than most people would realize. Now, granted, most of them were not professionally run, not the institutions that we expect today, and some were little more than sideshows. They were attractions, but there was a drive to bring together the artifacts of the past and put them on display for others to see. Now, the museum, as we think of it today, is really an 18th century creation. They came out of the cabinets of curiosities of the 17th century. These were things of the great houses of Europe. The idea was, if you were somebody of learning, of erudition, you had literally a cabinet, a large thing that you put stuff into. Mainly natural history pieces, rocks, old things that you could show off to your fellow elite and show just how erudite you were, how educated you were. And out of these cabinets of curiosities came the earliest museums. Now, out of these cabinets of curiosities came the early museums. The first one was Sir Hans Sloane's museum in London. It was purchased by the British government, and it became the beginning of the British Museum. So when you go to the British Museum, that came out of a collection of one man. His collection was 71,000 pieces. And that became the origin of the British Museum. In the United States, the first museum was the Charleston Museum, which was founded in 1773, literally before the United States, and was not open to the public until 1824. It's still in operation today. You can actually go to the first museum in the United States. Now, another U.S. predecessor museum was Charles Willson Peale's Philadelphia Museum. This was the first private museum that was created in the United States. It was the first one that started out with the idea of a pay-to-view model. The idea that we'll have all this great stuff and people will pay money to come in, and that will allow us to run a museum. By the way, it still doesn't work today. If you ever think that you're going to start a museum and enough people will come through and pay the gate and that'll run your museum, no, it won't. I can tell you this. But basically, with the Polk presidency, we got the West. We got Oregon and Washington, we got the Southwest, we completed the United States, as we think of it, the continental United States, and Alta California, the Southwest, all of that. You all know that. Didn't have any museums out here. Spanish didn't have any museums here. British didn't have any museums here. Mexicans didn't have any museums here. But the Americans came in here. Had to start museums, right? Wouldn't that make the most sense? Well, in fact, what did we have? In 1850, we had the Society of California Pioneers get started. 1850. And we get a group that all of a sudden says, hey, we need to have something saying, we're here. And you had to have been in California for 3 years in order to join this group. And one of the things they started doing was collecting artifacts and collecting papers and putting them on display. And they started creating a museum in their offices. This was the first museum in California. They were originally in Brannan's Express building in San Francisco. They eventually housed the first bear flag. It wasn't the Clampers that had it. That was 1935. But they had the first bear flag and a couple of other original bear flags on display, and a number of other early artifacts. And they had them in their original Pioneer Museum and their new Pioneer Hall, all of which was really great. Until 1906, and we had an earthquake and fire in San Francisco. Oops. And everything burned to the ground. Thankfully, they did have a couple of vaults, and a few of their early documents and a few artifacts were in their vaults, but everything else was lost in their collection. They started recollecting, and they still have a museum today, but their early collection was lost. But this was the kind of museum that started out with a focus. This was a museum that was focused on the glorification of the American takeover of the West. This was saying it was not interested in the Indian heritage or the Spanish heritage or the Mexican heritage. This was talking about the American takeover. So, yeah, it had a certain viewpoint on its history. The Society of California Pioneers Museum today is very different than the early one, but as with a number of early museums, there was very much a viewpoint. That's sort of to be expected. Now, there was another early museum in California, and it was the earliest private museum that I've been able to find in the West. And that's this one. This was the Pacific Museum of Anatomy and Natural Science. This was founded in San Francisco in 1863, created by a Dr. Louis J. Jordan. And I say a Dr. Louis J. Jordan because I have no idea whether that's his real name or not. He claimed to be a member of the Royal College of Surgeons in London, a doctor of medicine in Edinburgh, a demonstrator of anatomy and surgery. His was an institution for men, aimed at helping with medical problems. Now, I don't know whether you can see in this, but you might notice that there are a number of female anatomy specimens in this image. His thing was, he sold a book, this book. You could order this book for $0.25. He advertised the book all over the West, and for this book, by the way, the book was The Philosophy of Marriage. It was a series of 4, that's the book. It went through at least 47 editions. Now it claimed it went through at least 47 editions. It's very rare today, so I kind of wonder about that, but it may have. You can see 4 important lectures on the functions and disorders of the nervous system and reproductive organs. And you could then have private consultations with him. Now, the interesting thing was this particular museum continued to function through 1906. This was in San Francisco, and it had not just that you could have private consultations with him, but he did have all kinds of wax models, bones, anatomical freaks, botanical specimens, and similar items. It was sort of a sideshow museum. But it had a lot of other things. And as part of this book, and what's really interesting about the books, is they also had a complete listing of what was in the museum, as you can see. Had the scalp of an Apache Indian. But right after that, the section of an ilium and all of that. But they actually got, by 1863, they had the head of Joaquin Murrieta, celebrated bandit and murderer, well known in California in the early days as a most desperate character and terror of the country. He was shot by Captain Harry Love, who secured a state reward of $5,000 by his capture. Now, interestingly, on the page right after this, they had the hand of another desperado named Three-Fingered Jack. And right after that, a kangaroo in spirits. And a whole series of Egyptian mummies, all one family. Of course, that's what they claimed, who knows? Interestingly enough, as late as 1893, those 2 items are still being written up in the San Francisco newspapers as being on display at this museum in San Francisco. And it is not, and in the earthquake and fire, The museum doesn't burn up, but it is destroyed in the earthquake and fire. And everything in the museum, like I say, it doesn't burn, but it's destroyed, and it is just buried as part of the rubble from the building that this was in. So this is apparently, we don't know, of course, because who knows if this was Marietta's head. We don't know whether it was at all Marietta's head and Three Finger Jack's hand, but it is as close as we know whatever happened to those. Because we do know that they were at least here and had been on display in this museum in San Francisco until 1906, and were finally destroyed in 1906. So it's the other kind of museum that was in San Francisco at that time, and was on display and being written up on a regular basis in the San Francisco newspapers. Now, there were other museums in San Francisco, historical groups. One of the big ones, and it's been in the newspaper in the last couple of years, is the California Historical Society. Now, the California Historical Society, what's interesting about the California Historical Society is we all know that it's gone out of business again. And it's unfortunate that its collections have gone to Stanford. But the California Historical Society was originally proposed in 1852. It didn't work. It didn't get started. Now they tried again in 1866. They tried again in 1870. In 1871, John Dwinell actually got one started for a couple of years, and it went out of business. They tried to get it started again in 1874, tried to get it again in 1883. In 1886, they got it started again when it merged with the California Genealogical Society, and it went out of business in 1891. Got it started again in 1902, and it went out of business. Went out of business again in 1906, thanks to the earthquake and fire. Earthquake and fire is a bad combination for museums. So, you know, it keeps going in and out of existence, in and out of existence. And in 1922, Charles Templeton Crocker underwrote the rebirth, again, of the California Historical Society. Now, the California Historical Society, in all of these, was a private group. It wasn't a state-funded group. It was a private group. And it got started. And in 22, finally, it's going. So it's going, and it's going, and it's running just fine. And in 2024, it went out of business again. It's always unfortunate when an historical group goes out of business. I'd be the first one to say that. But at least with the 2024 demise of the California Historical Society, it went out of business in the correct way. That its collections went to a public collection and it's being preserved. What I don't like to see, and what should never be done, is that a public collection goes out on the open market. That's wrong. And in this case, it has not. The other interesting thing is, over the years, the California Historical Society used 3 different dates for what it was its origin date. It used 1852, 1871, and 1886. So when you go back and look at its history, depending on when you're looking at its history, it used different dates. It couldn't keep track of when its origin date was. And when you look at it, it's like, okay, fine. We'll just go with whatever you want this particular decade. But the fact is, you guys have been trying this over the years. maybe you'll get something else in another few years and you'll come back again. But it's not all that unusual, unfortunately. But let me segue at this point into other state historical societies to give you an idea of when various states have come up with their own historical societies, most of which have had museums. And then I'll talk to you about some of the other odd little museums that have been out there, because they're kind of fun. The earliest state, well, territorial, historical society after California was New Mexico. They got their territorial historical society in 1859. Great idea. Only problem was we had this little dust up back east called the Civil War, and in 1862 they shut down. They didn't get started again until the 1880s. 1883, in fact, because 3/4 of their board went to fight for the South. A bad choice. And they got a museum started, they put it in the Palace of the Governors, and eventually that went to the State Museum, which was a state museum, and so that is now part of the State Museum. It's not part of the Historical Society of New Mexico. So they have a historical society, but it's not a museum. The next was Arizona. They got theirs in 1864, but they didn't get a museum until 1884. So, but at least they were the next one to actually get a territorial historical society, but they were a little late to get a state. Montana gets to be next. That's New Mexico, Palace of the Governors. That's where they put their museum. Montana was next. That's 1865. They were interesting because when Montana became a territory, 7 months after they became a territory, their territorial legislature legislated an historical society. So they said, we're so proud of being a territory, we're going to have a territorial historical society. We're not going to leave this up to the people, we're going to legislate one. Gotta give them credit for that. Colorado was next, that's 1879. That was, they weren't quite sure what they wanted to call it though. It was created by the state legislature as the State Historical and Natural History Society. And then it was renamed the Colorado Historical Society. And in 2009, trying to be updated or whatever, they became History Colorado. And that's what they are today. I guess they didn't want to be old-fashioned or something. And then this is Idaho. They were a territorial society founded in 1881 as the Historical Society of Idaho Pioneers. And this was 9 years before they became a state. But they operate the State Museum now. And just as an aside, if you're into firearms, they actually have the largest collection of Class 3 firearms in any state museum in the United States. Actually quite a nice collection. And one of the oddities on that is they are, because of the collection that they accepted, they have to take at least 2 Class 3 firearms out to the range every year and demonstrate them. I'd like to have that job. Oh, that's just me. Washington was next in 1891. They got theirs. Oregon got theirs in 1898. Nevada didn't get theirs till the 20th century, 1904, though their first agitation for a state historical society was 1866, but they didn't get one. Wyoming in 1953. Now, They had wanted one as early as 1895, nothing got started. 1921, nothing got started, but that happens sometimes. You know, that people want to have an historical society, but it just doesn't come together. But Wyoming does have a good state museum, well worth going to see. But they weren't the only ones that, you know, got museums together. Now, in terms of private museums that ended up making a difference, one of the earliest was in Utah. This is Temple Square in Utah, and it's hard to tell, but right down here in Temple Square, there was a pioneer house. And in that house, John W. Young, one of Brigham Young's sons, started a private museum in 1869. It was originally called the Home Museum and Menagerie, and it started out as a collection of minerals and stuffed animals. He liked the idea of collecting animals, stuffed animals, and living animals from Utah, and wanted to put them on display and wanted people to be able to learn about the history of Utah and what Utah had to see, and wanted classes of students to come through and all of this. They had historical artifacts as well. He employed a fellow named, and I'm going to mess up this name, Guglielmo Giosu Rossetti San Giovanni. I know I screwed that up somewhere. He was the first curator, and he hoped to get funding from the church. He didn't get that, but he put thousands of dollars into his museum, and he was getting stuff in from various donors. It became very well known. He charged to go through. It was 25 cents to go through the museum. He had, by 1871, San Giovanni had left, and he was replaced by a fellow named Joseph Barfoot, who had worked for Brigham Young, and he was well known for being able to identify natural history specimens. So they thought highly of it, the church thought highly of it. At one point, his son was excommunicated, but then he was allowed back into the church. That happened a lot. The museum continued to grow. The church rather liked it. By 1878, the church actually bought the collection, and John continued to operate the museum with Barfoot. The museum, the name changed to the Deseret Museum, and a new location was found just south of Temple Square. 1891, Dr. James Talmadge became the curator of the museum, and Young stepped out of operation. This is an unusual one because it continued to operate. And it was turned over to a new group. They tried to operate it, but it became unsuccessful. The museum closed in 1903 and the collections were packed, but they were not sold off. They were maintained, and eventually in 1906, when the American Association of Museums was founded as a national organization for museums in the United States, they joined. The museum joined as part of this national association. It was finally reopened in 1911, and though it was closed as the Deseret Museum in 1918, the collections were dispersed among other museums in Salt Lake City, and they continue to exist today. So it was one of those museums that, while the museum doesn't exist, the collections still do. Now we'll talk about some of the other museums. And one of the things I have to point out is when I use the term museum, And when you see the term museum, you have to understand it is not a patented term, it is not a copyrighted term, it is a term that anybody can use. And it doesn't necessarily mean a public institution. Somebody can say, oh, I've got a bunch of old stuff at home, it's almost a museum. No, it isn't. It's a bunch of stuff. That's not a museum. Now we're going into some of those. This is Colonel Hafford. Colonel Hafford had his museum initially in Tombstone, Arizona. As you can see in this ad from the Tombstone, I've forgotten which one, Tombstone newspaper, has made another addition to his museum, this time a gopher and squirrel. Boy, that's something you want to go see, isn't it? He has the finest collection of animals, birds, insects, reptiles, etc. in Arizona. This was Hafford's museum. Hafford had a retail liquor establishment in Tombstone, Arizona. It was best known because this is where Wyatt Earp and crew gathered when they started the famous walk down to the OK Corral. They were outside of this establishment, but it was known for having Hafford's museum in it and his bar. Now, he was here until 1898 when he moved over to Randsburg, California, and started a retail liquor establishment there, and then 2 years later passed away from some undisclosed illness. But did anybody ever tell you that Wyatt Earp and crew started at a museum when they walked down to the OK Corral? I've never seen that. You know, they didn't point that out in the movie. I would have liked to have known that. But yes, this was the museum there. Now, in Oregon, in 1893, there was a Professor Wood, or Woodward. He went by two variations on his name, and he started the Oregon Museum. And the Oregon Museum is interesting because, between 1873 and 1874, he shows up in newspapers all over Oregon and Washington and California. This guy was great at advertising. You find little bits in the newspaper all over the place talking about what he's doing and his museum and things that are going into the museum. He was good at advertising. You know, so you've got this one here. Persons visiting Portland should not fail while there to call and examine the large collection of rare and beautiful articles on exhibition. You know, an hour or two can very profitably be spent at the museum. Okay, well, you'll see what you can see. The story goes that a whale 24 feet long was towed up to Portland last Saturday and will be placed on exhibition for a few days, after which the skeleton will be dressed and presented at Wood's Oregon Museum. Ooh, you know, you're going to be able to see all kinds of things there, you know. And it's interesting, one of the other things that you can see here, a tapeworm, 728 feet long, was removed from the stomach of a man in this city on Saturday the 12th and may be seen at the museum. Now that one I'm a little worried about. But that was at the Portland Museum. You want to see a tapeworm 728 feet long, you can see it there. And they also had a scalp from the late Modoc War, hoping that somebody could identify the soldier it was taken from. Now, this is a role I never would want one of my museums to have to be placed in. But, you know, and if you wanted to go through, it was 25 cents for adults, half price for children under 10.
What?
Yep. If your child was under 10, it was half of 25 cents, or 12 and a half cents for your kids. Yeah. Great place to go. And your kids would know what a 728-foot long tapeworm looked like. Everybody can learn something, I guess. But these kinds of museums existed as well. Another museum of that type, this was one in New Mexico, free museum, free. But this kind of museum was one that would have been in a retail establishment, L. Fisher. This one was in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And it had, and you can read that, it's a little bit of everything, and the idea was to get you in so that if you went through it, you would not only see all these wonderful things, but there was also lots of stuff for sale, so you could buy all of that as well. And you know, these kinds of museums were throughout the West as well. But, and then I want to talk about, just to end up, and then I'll take questions. There were two museums in the mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century, that I think did more to define for people in the mid to later 20th century what the Old West was. Not necessarily correctly, but what it was as people learned to think about it. And one of them was in LA and one of them was in Orange County. One was Marion Spears Museum. It was called the Western Trails Museum. Marion Spears was a mining engineer, got interested in mining history, started collecting. In Huntington Beach, he built an addition on his property, and then he got to know a friend of his named Walter Knott, and they got to talking, and Walter Knott said, "Why don't you move your museum onto my ghost town?" And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what, you build a building for my museum, and you hire me to run my museum, and I'll give you the museum." And Knott, who really liked Marion Spears, I actually have a letter that Knott wrote to a couple of guys who wanted to buy the museum later on, and he refused to sell it to them because he said, "No, I have this agreement with Mr. Spears, and I will not sell it." But he said he agreed with Marion, and he hired Marion to run the Western Trails Museum. And he gave all of his stuff. I'd like to ask for a show of hands. How many of you have been through the Western Trails Museum at Knott's Berry Farm? Okay. Yeah, I certainly did when I was growing up. And I know that as a kid, I would go through that when I would go to Knott's Berry Farm, when Knott's Berry Farm was free. And you would go there, I would spend hours in there just looking at the stuff, reading his labels. He wrote those labels himself. And his interpretation was the interpretation that millions of visitors had for the Old West. And that's what you have to think about That's Marion there, in front of an earlier picture of the Western Trails Museum. This is a man who, because he was interested and put together the museum himself, wrote his own labels, did his own interpretation. Walter Knott said, fine, put it out. It was free. Everybody could walk through it. There was the filter was solely him. And it was his view of what he understood of the Old West. So he gave his impression, his view of the Old West. And everybody who went through Knott's Berry Farm, and you know, that was not just Americans, that was around the world, came out with that view of the Old West. So that was an extraordinarily important museum for interpreting what people viewed of how the Old West was conquered, how people lived, and what the stuff of the Old West was. Now, there was one other museum that did that in a slightly different way. And that was this museum. This was W. Parker Lyons Museum. And I don't know how many of you may have gone to the Pony Express Museum in Arcadia. I've got a hand back here. Anybody else? I see somebody over here. Art, did you ever go there? Anybody else? Abe, did you ever go there? I didn't make it there. But the thing about W. Parker Lyons' place was he knew how to make money by renting artifacts to the movie studios. So this is where, during the 30s, 40s, 50s, the movie studios, when they were making all those westerns, this is where a lot of them went to get set dressing. This is why when you look at the movies of that time period and you see some rough-hewn cabin, they've got a beautifully painted oil lamp in the cabin. No, they wouldn't. You know, and they had really nice trunks everywhere. And they had, you know, great buggies and things like, a lot of stuff got rented here at Lyons' place, at the Pony Express Museum. So this is a museum that gave us the visual image that we saw on television shows and movies. That we never knew, we didn't understand, and the movies didn't think about it. They're just looking for a source for stuff. And Lyon knew how to make money, so he'd rent this stuff. So this is what we got, where we got that from. So anyways, and Lyon was a guy who came to California in 1865 as a child, grew up in San Francisco, became the first mayor of Fresno, I think it was, and started Lyon Storage. You know, had a really interesting background, but he started collecting in 1935 and loved stuff. He was like Marion Spear, just loved the Old West, loved the stuff, you know, and put it out on display. But then he monetized it and figured out a way to make money on it. He wasn't trying to create the image, he loved the image. You know, he wasn't trying to create an image that would change how we viewed the past. He was viewing the past through his own lens of it, shall we say. So anyways, that's some of the history of the museums of, by the way, if you wonder what happened to this, when he died, his collection was sold to Bill Harrah of Harrah's in Reno. It was shown up there until Bill Harrah died, and the collection was then sold as a unit to a guy who wanted 3 pistols out of the collection. The entire collection was sold, and then the collection was broken up and just sold off. But this was a private collection, and it wasn't a public nonprofit. It wasn't a 501c3, it wasn't a 178.1, which is a government museum. This was a private collection, so it could just be sold. So anyways, that's what I have for you today. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Paul? Thank
you. Bergman Museum in Riverside County.
What's that?
Bergman.
Yeah, I know the Bergman Museum.
Yeah.
Great museum.
Is it still there, and how is it?
I believe it's still there. I think it is. Yeah.
Dispersed. It's closed, I think, or something to that effect.
Yeah, but I think that's a 501c3, isn't it? I'm not sure on that. I can't tell you for sure on that. But I thought that one was,
Mark?
I think that's a private nonprofit, but yeah.
The collection was sold off.
Oh, was it?
Yes. The
Okay.
current resident, the building is still there. The current resident there is Harry Bergman's grandson.
So it was private? It was a
Yes,
private collection?
Harry Bergman had collected all that stuff. His father, his grandfather, himself, and the like, and he put that in that building there. But once he left, it was open for a little while longer, and then I guess the daughter sold it all off.
Okay, so this is the problem that you run into. When a collection is a private collection, it may have the name museum, but it isn't. It's a private collection. And if it's a private collection, it can just be sold. It's not a public institution, it's a private collection. If it's that, an example you might be aware of is the Santa Monica Air Museum. A few years ago, there was a big Santa Monica Air Museum. That was a private collection. People were giving it things and all of that, and then it closed one day and everything was sold off, even the stuff that was given to it, because you can give anybody anything. But if you give it to a private individual, you may think it's a public institution, but if it's not, it's just like you gave it to me. If you give it to me and I say thank you, I can turn around and sell it to somebody else. You know, and I'm not saying give it to me, but you know, that's the way it works. You know, and so you have to be careful on that. Yeah.
Back to 1922, Henry R. Wagner with Templeton Crocker.
Yeah.
Major player in the California Historical Society.
Absolutely it was, yeah.
Renewal
Yep.
and the revival of it.
Yes, absolutely it was.
Gave his life to it from 22 to his death at age 94 in 1957 in San Marino.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, the lion, he was down in the Cuban basin there in 1935 in San Marino City, kicked him out. He went out to Struve's Arcadia
Yep.
after that.
Yep. But again, on something like that, it was a 501c3, but if you don't have the income to keep going, yeah, Chuck.
So in that 1853 San Francisco museum where they were showing the bodies and the caskets, so what were those?
Those were models. Those were wax models.
Those weren't real people.
No. No, they had like mummies in there. Those are real, but most of what you were seeing in that were wax models. Yeah, hey.
1948, centennial of the gold rush. Schools had a lot of field trips. I was about 8 years old, and our field trip was to the Lummis Southwest Museum. And you went through a long, dark tunnel with diarrhea. No, not diarrhea, dioramas.
Yes, you did.
And maybe you got a little, because it was scary to get to that elevator. And one of the exhibits there was a cross-section of a Indian grave with a dead Indian all scrunched inside. And that was there until 1971, when Native American activists confronted the people who were running the museum and said, this is disrespectful to our culture, our people. So he said, well, what do you want to do about it? He said, well, we'll make a deal with you. They said, you leave that there, but put in a similar cross-section of a dead white man. And
Sounds
they
good
said,
to me.
no, we'll just close it up, which is what they did.
Yep. They used to do that with Kehoe's bones. Kehoe's bones in Las Vegas were on display for years at the El Dorado Village after they were found in the cave up above the Colorado River in 1939. That in 47 they were put on display at El Dorado Village, and they were there until 59. They recreated the cave and just put it, first thing you'd see as you walked into El Dorado Village during El Dorado days was Kehoe in his cave. And then during the parade, they would pick them up and put them on the back of a trailer or a truck and put them in the parade too. I'm not saying it was right, I'm just saying they did it. Yes?
I'm just curious of your perspective of how museums and their view of the West has changed. I was just thinking, I'd seen the Geometry Museum many years ago, then we went back at Christmas after a couple decades, and I felt like all the weapons and the Western items were just relegated to one part of the basement, and that the whole museum had transformed.
I will tell you, I was in the museum field active, running museums for 44 years. I think that there has been way too much of an overcorrection. The reality is, you know, there was stuff in the early days when I was a kid that was, like Abe said, you know, you had just bodies out there. I can remember going to the Smithsonian and seeing old Soapy there, the Revolutionary War soldier that had turned into grave soap and was on display. And it was a white guy, you know, it just turned into grave soap. There was stuff like that that maybe wasn't quite as, you know, maybe we shouldn't have put him on display. But there's a lot of stuff that we need to be aware that we have to tell the whole story out there. And in all of my institutions, I tried to tell the whole story. I don't like the idea of balkanizing history. I think you need to tell all of history. And the idea of just taking chunks of history and putting it away because you don't happen to like the fact that guns were part of history, or the fact that something else was part of history and you don't happen to like it. Well, I don't care whether you like it or not. I don't care whether I like it or not. It's part of history. You have to tell it. You know, and that's what we all have to do if we're going to tell history. You know, we're going to tell the history of an area, and I've told a lot of history out there. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. It's just history. You know, it's our story. You know, and the problem is that way too often, as a way of being sensitive, we get rid of history. That's a bad idea, because then you're not telling a decent story, you know? And the reality is you have to tell the whole story. And you can do that without being insensitive, you know? And if somebody's going to get overly sensitive, you just gotta say, yeah, sorry about that. You know, in every institution I was ever the director of, my name was out front, I was available. Somebody had an issue with our exhibits, the front desk had my number on speed dial, and I came out and talked to anybody that had an issue. Nobody could say, you know, the word in that exhibit came down from God on high. You know, nope. We had people that wrote those, and here's why. And if you don't like it, well, sorry about that, but here's the reasons. You know? And everybody had access. So anyways, that's my perspective, and, you know, if I was going to be the director, that's my job. I had to be the one to step out and answer the questions. And if they didn't like my answers, well, they could get angry at me and they could go yell at my boss. You know, okay, you know, sometimes they yell at me, okay. You know, I've been married 46 years, I'm used to getting yelled at sometimes. It happens, you know, thankfully not real often.
What became of Harris Sparks automobiles?
187 vehicles were donated to the National Automobile Museum, and the rest went up for auction.
And where is that?
That's in Reno. It's a great museum, you should go see
Right
it.
on the river, Truckee now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the National Automobile Museum. It's where the Thomas Flyer is and all of those things. It is a phenomenal museum. Yeah.
Do you know what happens to the Sparks Hotel barbed wire museum?
No, I don't. I'm sorry to say, but
It was excellent.
yeah, that one I can't tell you. One of the things I will tell you, however, if you see a museum in a property in Nevada, if it's a casino, we call them properties. That's what we call them. But if it's a museum in a property, it's only going to be there as long as they can't make more money putting in slot machines and other kind of gambling in those areas. That's the reality. Don't ever expect that a museum in a property is going to be there forever, because it's not. Just be aware of that. Any other questions? Otherwise, thank you. I enjoyed it.
We're mark one of our plaques here and a couple of gifts.
Thank you.
And we want to thank you very much, Mark, for coming. Thanks, sir. So next month will be Sarah Kais speaking about the Overland Trail, and it should be a really good talk. She's a professor at University of Nevada, Reno.
Joe.
So see you next month.
We forgot to introduce guests.
Oh, we
We'll
did.
do that next month.
They may never come here. Guests.
Yes, sir.
You want to introduce this? So, excellent idea. So who at which table has a guest? How about right here? A guest?
I'll introduce Vince Zarimsky, a good friend of mine, only known him since first grade.
Very good. Dave, you have a guest? Dave, do you have a guest? Yeah, you have a guest.
Yeah,
Your what?
Oh.
My wife couldn't wait to see Mark again because she has a huge crush on him. We were in Las Vegas and his magnet is still on our refrigerator.
Very good.
And I'm not sure, but I think it comes sick. You kiss it every once in a while.
Very good. Very good.
I remember this
So,
time.
Nick, any guests at your table, please?
That's a old timer there.
No guests there?
It's you.
Gary, any guests there?
Yes, we do. I'd like to introduce Randy Parker, a guest from Santa Clarita for us.
Anybody guests at John Selber's table?
I brought my friend Gina DeMassa, fellow Altadenan. Our lead editor on Barbara and my book called Rare Work. She's a very talented musician and a great collector of beautiful things.
Very good. And Mark, any guests at your table, please?
Yep, I got Scott Wilson. He's a subscriber. He lives in La Habra. Invited him on. Good to see him here.
Very good.
We just walked into this, and it was a very wonderful, interesting presentation. I'm very glad to be invited. Thank you for all you fine folks. Wonderful get together.
Well, great to hear you say that, and all of you guests, you can certainly become members. Okay, thanks. See you guys next month. Thank you very much.
Yes.
See, Mark, get up here. Mark, they forgive you, right? And you up there with your picture for the brand. Very good. Let me turn this off.
You want